Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, I'll be talking to the leader of Russia's Bolshevik Party about Vladimir Putin, to a former Pentagon insider about George Bush, and to best-selling author Chris Hitchens about God. But first, Europe. Leaders of the 27 member states of the European Union are today meeting in Brussels in an attempt to agree a new treaty, one to replace the constitution thrown out by the voters of France and the Netherlands in 2005. So which way is Europe going to go? And should Tony Blair in his last act as Prime Minister hold out against his European friends? Well, joining me now is the man who negotiated game, set and match Britain's opt-outs at the Maastricht Summit of 1992, and that's an appropriate phrase because it's a cricketing phrase as well, and we've got cricket on our agenda today. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Very, very good to have you with us. Must bring back a lot of memories of the times you had to get packed and go off to a European summit of one sort or the other. Is this just the game being replayed over again? What would you hope to happen?
Well, it's a tough series of negotiations. I think there's no doubt there's some changes that need to be made. You can't enlarge the European Union from 15 member states to 27 without making some institutional changes. So I think they're clearly there to be made, and I think there will be changes. I think the idea of not having a rotating 6-month presidency is a very good one. It was always a disruptive series of changes. I think Britain should certainly support that. There are bound to be some changes in the weighting votes when you have far more nations there. I think that clearly is acceptable. I think the problem that Tony Blair faces is where some of our European partners who are more inclined to be centralists than the United Kingdom wish to bring in new authorities to Europe over things like border controls, for example, and social and employment laws. Those are areas that I don't think the Prime Minister can concede, not because he's taking an anti-European stance, but because it wouldn't be in the interest of the British economy.
So there he's got to stand firm. In general, Europe is not such a sort of outrageous issue as it was when you were Prime Minister. It's hit the interest in Europe, at least in Britain and a lot of the other countries who are watching us now, that interest in Europe has lessened, hasn't it?
I think it's a better balance now. I think views of Europe are more balanced than they were in the 1990s. In the 1990s, there were many people who, frankly, disliked almost every aspect of European policy, and whatever happened, they saw demons even where none existed. Now, some of those people are still about, and I'm sure you'll find that with whatever agreement emerges from this particular summit. But I think over Europe as a whole, it's a slightly more clement atmosphere than it was.
In conversations we had all through the period building up and coming out of the Iraq War, you were very strong in your warnings. Those warnings have unfortunately come true.
I'm afraid they have. I mean, if you look at Iraq today, there are areas where a lot of progress has been made. But if you look particularly at Baghdad, there are still very great problems. Some neighborhoods have been cleared up. I think to that extent, the surge, the so-called surge in troops has worked. But of course, as the troops move on, often the insurgents move back. And I think we're a long way short of being in a position where we can say, well, Iraq is now stable. I think that is a long way away yet.
And what about the troops that are there, British troops and so on? I mean, can we really bring them all out when things are still going badly? Well,
I'd be surprised if we could. I mean, the British troops, of course, are in the south at Basra, where it's a much easier atmosphere than it is in and around the environment of Baghdad. And I think the hope is that a significant number of troops can be brought home during the course of 2008. Whether they all can, frankly, I doubt it. And in any event, even if all the troops came home in 2008 from the south, I'm sure the United States would ask us to play some part in whatever is happening in Baghdad, perhaps only special forces. But I'd be very surprised if Britain was wholly disengaged for quite a long time.
And what's the end game, do you think? I mean, what does the future hold for Iraq?
Well, it's still very cloudy, I think. And of course, the end game doesn't just depend, or in some ways even primarily depend, upon America and the United Kingdom and the coalition troops. There are some things that the Iraqi government are going to have to do, or you will never have a stable atmosphere. For example, we still don't know how the oil revenues would be divided. That plainly is crucial. we still haven't proceeded to bring the Sunnis back into the mainstream of life there. De-Baathification needs to be reversed. We need to bring them back in some form into the mainstream of political life. And then, of course, there's also the very thorny question of Kirkuk, a city that floats on oil, that the Kurds think belongs to them and others don't, where a referendum before the end of this year has been promised, but will not, I think, be delivered, about what the future of Kirkuk is. Now, they're all serious, destabilizing problems unless they're dealt with. And they're going to have to be dealt with by the government of Iraq primarily. They can't be dealt with externally. So I think there's a lot to be done internally by the Iraqis themselves, as well as externally by the coalition, before you have anything remotely approximating to a normal situation.
Thinking back to the first Gulf War and George Bush Sr. And yourself made the decision not to go on to Baghdad, and there are other reasons for that too, but this now is another powerful reason why you must be very, very
pleased.
Well,
there were many reasons at the time. I mean, firstly, we were operating under a UN mandate that was quite specific. The mandate was to expel the Iraqi invaders from Kuwait, not to go into Baghdad. But I think we were very cautious that if you go into Baghdad and take over a country, that is a very difficult and long-term enterprise. And I think we were very conscious too of the experience of the British in the 1920s, where we had a mandate, and it was a very bloody decade with a lot of British soldiers killed in what is now Iraq in the 1920s. So I think we were well aware of that at the time, though they weren't the only reasons why we decided to stop short of Iraq.
And anyway, if you were saying, as you were, that it would be difficult for the British to exit totally for the reasons you said, obviously America has got to look at this as a long-term engagement, hasn't it?
Well, I think the next big thing that's going to happen will be the report by General Petraeus on, I think, September the 13th. And he's due to report to the President and Congress on whether the surge, the increase in troops, has actually worked. Now, he can either say, yes, it has, which I doubt very much he'll say, no, it hasn't, it's been a complete failure, which I doubt he'll say either, because it hasn't been. And his most likely response is, it is a partial success, but it's only a partial success while we have the troops there, and in any event, we don't have enough troops. So I think come September, he is very likely to go back to Washington and say, we need to continue with this for much longer. We may need more money, we may need more troops. And then that is going to ignite quite a political debate, I think, in Washington during the latter part of this year.
And it was worth, this mission was worth the lives we and the Americans have lost, and since then,
I think you'll have to wait. I think we'll have to wait and see what the outcome is. And I think it'll be many years before you can look back and say either this was a very wise piece of policy that has changed the face of the Middle East for the better, or it was a folly that hasn't. And we won't know until we have the end game, and we aren't going to have the end game for a long time yet.
What about the rest of the Middle East at the moment? Do you feel that Middle East is making progress at the moment, or because of one of the internal battles in Palestine, among other things, do you feel things are getting worse?
Well, in some ways, the Middle East is making progress. If you look at the economic development down the Gulf, for example, if you look right at the tip of North Africa, Algeria and Libya, you see an area where there's tremendous economic growth. But locked in the middle of that, you have the problems with Iraq, the problems with Iran, and I think the sorest spot of all, the Arab-Israeli conflict over Palestine. And that has taken a very different turn in the last few weeks, with Hamas taking over Gaza. Now, any logical assessment of that is that this is a very damaging change. But it might also present an opportunity that wasn't there before. We now have the West Bank in a position where the rest of the world is now prepared to support the West Bank because the government there is not seeking as a policy objective the destruction of Israel. Now, if the West is wise, if it deals properly and generously with the West Bank, if it seeks to encourage investment, if it seeks to improve living standards, I think there's a very fair chance that the people in Gaza will see what happens if they turn away from terrorism and if they cooperate. Now, that may not change the mind of Hamas leaders, but it may change the minds of the people who have sympathy for them and who live in Gaza. So there might be a silver lining here that we can grasp, but only if the West is prepared to be wise and generous in the way in which it deals with the West Bank.
Then there could be...
Then I think you could make a real gain. I don't predict that will happen. Past history suggests it will be difficult, but I think it's an opportunity that Israel, the United States and the European Union should look to take advantage of.
And what about Northern Ireland? Now, there is something where the Downing Street Declaration that you signed as Prime Minister with Albert Reynolds and so on, from that stage on, things have progressed to the amazing duo running Ireland at the moment. It must fill you with joy, pride, that the Downing Street Declaration progressed to this point.
I'm very pleased. I always saw that there was a chance of an agreement there. We always knew it would be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so it has proved for me and for Tony Blair. It's often been very frustrating. But we're now there, and Northern Ireland has a wholly different future. I think if there's one lesson to draw from that, it's that you cannot make peace without negotiation. You cannot make peace if you address one another through megaphones at a distance. You have to engage, and you have to have a dialogue. It may be frustrating, you may be dealing with people that you have little sympathy for, but unless you enter into a dialogue, unless you enter into a process, the same sad condition of violence would continue without that. And I think that is a lesson, although there are many other differences, that is a lesson I think that's equally applicable to the Arab-Israeli dispute.
Yes, in a way, yes, there are lessons that could be drawn from...
Yes, I mean, it's not a direct analogy, but no. I think the lesson of dialogue is an analogy that can be drawn.
And let's hope it is. We're talking of a world today. Is it a safer world today than when you were Prime Minister?
I think it is overall. The biggest thing that happened, of course, in the last 20 years was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union, 2 things have happened. The dangers of regional conflict in many ways has grown, and we have seen that, particularly with terrorism. But the danger of an intercontinental nuclear confrontation has fallen away. And so I think the world is safer, even though there may be more areas that face particular problems than there were in the 90s. Overall, the world as a whole, I think, is safer.
Well, this has been a wonderful journey around that world, which we thank you for very much. And as I said, I wanted to come in conclusion at this another book by John Major, which everyone says is beautifully written. This one about cricket, and particularly the birth of cricket and so on. And it's called More Than a Game, and it's called that because it's literally been more than a game for you in your life. Yeah.
Well, and I think for what has happened with the development of Britain and its relationship with countries around the world. When the game, soon after the game was born, it began to be taken around the world by the Merchant Navy, the Royal Navy, the British Army. And I think there are many occasions where you've had political differences with someone in a country that plays cricket. But there is a bond that is formed as a result of it. It is more than a game for me, but I think throughout its long history, it's shown itself to be almost as potent an export as the English language itself.
What was the biggest surprise for you in putting this book together of the early days of cricket?
That some of the very early assumptions about cricket were mistaken. There were all sorts of assumptions about where it began, that it might have begun in Persia, an unlikely assumption, and it didn't. And in France, another unlikely assumption, and it didn't. And I think turning up the original source documents that led to those mistakes, I think was the most satisfying part. Perhaps not surprising, because I didn't really believe it, that the game had started in those countries, but certainly the most satisfying to show that it really didn't.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for this review of the whole world that we seem to have strolled through. It's been a delight.
David, nice to see you.
John Major, ladies and gentlemen. In a minute, I'll be talking to the leader of Russia's Bolshevik Party, Edward Limonov. That's after this short break.